Handout. Well, can I have your attention, please? Welcome to everybody to the 18th lecture in this series on Karl Rahner and the spiritual quest. Seems like we've been at this a long time, yet there's so much more that we could probably get out of this great theologian. I want to start tonight by reviewing a few things and maybe summarizing some of the main things we've seen in this 18-part series, and then perhaps spend a few minutes having a chance for comment and question. I might pose a question after my presentation on this about which of the things have meant most to you, and see if we could elicit some comments about the topics or the points that maybe you have remembered throughout this 18-part series. People have been here for various ones. Maybe some are here just for a few. But I'd like to get a little bit of feedback like that. And then we will talk more specifically about our topic tonight, which is the search for a simple faith. But what we've been doing is trying to look at the work of this great Jesuit theologian, Karl Rahner, to see how he might guide us in the spiritual search. So our premise has been that there is a quest in life, that there is a dynamism in our human spirit, that we are people who are searching, looking for something more. We are, as we like to say, self-transcendent creatures, always going beyond where we are at any given moment. And so the premise is that we're involved in that quest, and that it's good to be aware of it, that we need to articulate it, and it's good to have words for it. It's good to be with other people who are involved in that same search in life. There's something affirming about that. It feels good to know that there's other people like us, that we're not alone in trying to deepen our experience and come closer to the Lord, and trying to improve our relationships and so on. That all of that is part of what human beings in general are wrestling with. We can eclipse that. We can cover it over. We can forget it. We can be so busy it doesn't come to mind. We can neglect it. We can even deny that it's there, but it continues to be at work. That sort of churning in the guts at times, and other times sort of just a quiet search for something deeper or more. That is what constitutes us as human beings. So we started out with that spiritual quest, and we wanted to look at it, examine it in greater detail, bring it to life, give it words, articulate it, so that we could participate in the quest in a better fashion. Then what we wanted to do was to look at the German Jesuit theologian Karl Rahner to see what he tells us about that spiritual quest. We wanted to examine his life, what he was all about. We wanted to look at his writings and to bring that to bear upon the topic. It has not been, of course, specifically in the theology of Karl Rahner, but it has been an attempt to enter into dialogue with this man, to look at what he has written and to see how what kind of an impact it would make on us. What enlightenment is there? What insights do we pick up from him? So it's not an abstract study so that at the end of 18 lectures we are experts in Rahner. It's more like I'm involved in a search and I need all the help I can get, and let's look at this fellow and see what indeed he has to say to us. So that's how I've thought of the course. That's why we've had handouts to summarize his thinking. I've been hopeful that people would read those over, that they would take them home, maybe talk to somebody else about them. That's why we've had questions to guide us on the handouts. And then all through this, it's meant to have been a prayerful quest. The premise, maybe not often stated, is that we don't do this alone, that we are summoned to a higher life. There's a call at work in the world. There's a higher force or power that's running all of this, that even the very dynamism of our spirit is a gift. It's received. We don't have that coming. And so we've wanted to take a prayerful attitude towards all of this. We wanted to be receptive and open and in touch with the Spirit and talking to the Lord about our quest. So for each of the 18 classes, we've had a prayer. that guides us, something to meditate on later on. And a prayer from Rahner himself gives us a good example of his thinking and the way he himself tried to commune with the great God. So I would say that in general is what we have been about. Now we've tried to break that down into different topics as we've gone along. And one way of summarizing that is to say that we began in the most general kinds of notions of who we are. We've tried to get at what we commonly call an anthropology, that is an understanding of human existence, to see what kind of persons we are, to get a deeper feeling for that. And so, as I suggested before, the major content of that is to say we are people immersed in mystery, that we are surrounded by a power greater than ourselves, that there is something out in front of us in life alluring us, drawing us. There is something ahead of us awaiting us. And it sets up the whole goal of life. It's why we enter on the journey. It's the reason that we think the journey has meaning, because it's going someplace. There's a goal. There's a future. Or as we like to say it, there is the absolute mystery out in front of us waiting for us, that the future is being created. That as we walk this path, we don't get to a point where we just drop over a cliff into nothingness, but as we go in this journey, we eventually move into gracious hands. That there's a force or power awaiting us, the one that we call our God. So we would like to think of ourselves as immersed in this absolute mystery, that which was always beyond our comprehension. God is always greater than any of our images. So we wanted to talk about God and prayer. Know that we are self-transcendent creatures. We're searching and groping, but the one we're moving towards is the one we call God. And what we discover is that God has been within us all the time. As Augustine said, that God is closer to us than we are to ourselves, that he's found to be the inner dynamism. He's the source. We call that grace, that God has given himself to us. Not a gift, not something external, but God has given himself to us. That's what we mean by grace. And that then it sets up the prayerful situation. A big part of all of this is to learn how to pray better. And that seems to start with a sense of dependence upon the great God, that we are not in control of ourselves, that finally we reach that stage when we begin to understand that there is a power greater than ourselves in control. It is that abiding sense of dependency that we call prayer. We are admonished to pray always. It doesn't mean we're saying our Fathers all the time. It does mean that we try to walk around with a sense that we are in gracious hands, that there's one more powerful than us controlling it all, that we are fundamentally dependent. And then out of all of that, we try to learn something about how to articulate that, how to be in the presence of that God, how to sharpen our awareness. And we go through stages where maybe we talk to this mystery, and then we get to the stage where we have fewer words going, and we're more in a sense of abiding in the presence of the great God, just feeling that power and strength. So we began to look at who we're tending towards the great God. So after that, we moved into the whole question of, well, how is that mystery made concrete? I mean, how do we know about it? What reveals the mystery to us? And that's when we got in the whole question of Jesus Christ in the winter quarter. We began talking then about Christ as the parable of the Father, as the human face of the mystery, as the one who reveals to us what this vast mystery is all about, who says that we can call the mystery Abba, Father. So that the great God is not just remote, is not just far off up there in the sky, and we're just actors down here, and he's sort of unconcerned about us. But in the Christian understanding, when we look at Jesus, we realize, no, the great mystery has drawn near, has come so close, has come and pitched his tent among us, has lived this human life of ours, knows it completely, personally present in Jesus of Nazareth. So that Jesus of Nazareth becomes the concrete absolute, the human face of God. If we want to know what the mystery is like that surrounds us and that always eludes us as more than we can comprehend, we get it by looking at Jesus of Nazareth. And we find that then in the New Testament. The New Testament becomes our way of getting in touch with that. It witnesses to Jesus. It is the community's remembrance of who Jesus was. The New Testament didn't just drop down from the sky. God didn't dictate it to certain evangelists. But the New Testament is the product of the community of believers, the people who were convinced that Jesus had been raised to life. So the community remembered that, celebrated it, used the message of Jesus to solve its problems, and to catechize, to preach to others. And it was out of all of that rich mix that we eventually got this New Testament. We had these great editors or redactors who were able to pull that together in those marvelous documents that we call the Gospels. So we talked a lot about Christ, about his resurrection, that being the vindication and validation of who he was, trying to see how that shows us most fundamentally that love is stronger than all of the dark forces, even that of death. So a lot about Jesus Christ, really the center point of this whole spiritual quest for us. And then we talked about a less important matter. We talked about the church. Church as a community that continues the remembrance of Jesus. Church as a place where we worship, where we are instructed, where we are brought to a greater sense of service in the world. The church, the main image we wanted to have of the church was of a community, not just an institution, not just a structure with laws and rules and doctrines and rituals and so on, but a community where the memory of Jesus is preserved. A grouping of people where there is mutuality and where all are co-responsible for the well-being of this community. A community where there is to be a richness, a nourishment, a support in all of the struggles that we go through. And then, after seeing all of that, we looked more particularly in this quarter at how we're supposed to live out this spiritual life. How we are to be creatures of freedom. And I suppose one of the lectures that means the most to me is the one on the question of freedom. The notion that we are making ourselves to be what we will be forever. That freedom is not just the ability to choose this or that, but it is the root capacity that we have to take up an attitude towards all of the givens of life. All of the things we have no control over, we still have the freedom to take up an attitude towards it. So we are either live in rejection of all of that, angry about it, frustrated with our lives, feeling we've been dealt a bad hand, totally angry, frustrated, upset, feeling that life is unfair because of the situation we find ourselves in. Or we adopt a faith stance that says, no, I need to accept all of that. I need to live with what I've got. I need to make the most out of my situation. I can take up an attitude towards all of that. I'm called upon to get a healthy perspective on that life of mine so that I do all I can to better it, to change it, but at the same time I'm able to let go of what I cannot manage. And so that brings us to Rahner's great central point about the whole of the spiritual life, that it is summed up in the phrase self-acceptance. That the whole of the spiritual life, if we're going to break it all down, he says this often in his writings, the key to it all, to becoming a better Christian, to coming closer to Christ, to being more responsive to the mystery, is self-acceptance. To accept who I am, my situation in life, to accept the fact that I am interdependent, that I need to interact in a healthy way with other people, and that most especially that I am dependent on the absolute mystery and rule over my life. So that self-acceptance then becomes the great center of Christian life, but as Rahner repeats, always and often yet how difficult that is to do. It is simple, but so difficult to do. So in the spiritual life, we keep finding ways in which we are not able to accept reality. Ronner says his definition of sin is to culpably and with knowledge and foresight to reject reality, to refuse to live with reality. So in a sense for him, sin is illusion. It is blindness. It is the refusal to deal with life as it really is. And then that brings us to the question of death, which we took up last time. That is, in a sense, death summarizes all of that. The death sets the boundary for us. That death is a way of understanding a whole lot of what Christianity is all about, because there we are called upon to finally to accept our finitude, our creatureliness, the fact that we are not God as we would like to be. So that's what sets the boundary and the limitations for all of us. So that death then would be our freest moment. Death is our chance to recapitulate what Jesus of Nazareth was doing in his own death and resurrection, to die with him, to die to self, in order that we can be raised to a new and richer life. That then brings us up to, I think, where we are now. It's been a long journey in a sense, a whole lot of ideas. You could, it's almost too much. It's too rich. There's too many ideas floating around, too many long quotes from Ronner, too many prayers in a way, too many ideas. Very difficult kind of thing to get hold of and to master. But that sort of sets the stage then for what we want to do in this very last class, which is to talk about how we reduce that complexity to a greater simplicity. How we're able to pull that all together in a more intelligible and credible way. So I want to stop there and with that part of my presentation, which is meant to be a reminder summary to people, and see if anybody wants to ask me about that, or I think it would be sort of interesting to hear some comments if people want to say something, well, out of all this 17 lectures, the one that, the point that struck me was this or that. Let's just see if we've got response. I'm going to force that. If people want to, fine, and if not, we can move on. At this point, questions or comments along that line at all? Billy has said the question about religious rhythms and so on. What aspect of that? Okay, I'm going to repeat these and maybe springboard them, okay? It's a way of pulling the summary together. This is good. The statement is made that the question about following our own rhythms in the spiritual life is crucial, that we don't have the same rhythms, that we need to find out our own ways that work best for us. And that goes with things like the frequency of the sacraments, right? In some people, Mass every day is what roots them. It helps them ward off chaos, to know who they are, keeps them going. For other people, if they went that often, it would be routine. They need to go less often. The same way of what time of the day we would pray. Some people just for years have struggled to say night prayers before they go to bed. They always fall asleep and end up feeling guilty. If they would just remember to say prayers in the morning, they would do far better. Same way with going to confession. I think the very healthy experiment that's going on now, people trying to figure out how often they ought to go, instead of just going once a week or once a month because someone said to go that often. Those are examples of where I think, we're encouraged to find our own rhythms. And a lot of that is trusting our experience, I think. If I springboard all these this much, we'll be here all night. Yeah.
I like the point of pointing out that in human, already the divine is present.
Okay, I'll also summarize that and talk about that. It is said that the point that already within our humanity there is divinity, that God is present in the human experience, present within our whole human existence, that is an important point. And I think that really is crucial to the Ronarian theology. An older theology was something like this. Grace was seen very often as a superstructure. Grace was seen on top of nature. It was seen as sort of to become baptized or to be a believer was like getting on an elevator and going up to a higher level. That was one of the images that was often used. In other words, grace was above nature. And it was not always possible even to know what that world was about or even experience it. The common statement that, well, you couldn't know if you were in the state of grace or not. There would be no real contact or interpenetration. Very often that was played off in terms of two worlds, a sacred world and a secular world, so that the Lord didn't have much to do with what one was doing on the golf course. That it didn't have much to do with the bridge table, or work, or what went on in the humdrum routine of cooking meals and making beds and going to work or working in a factory. That had little to do with any of that. Maybe some applications. Maybe you're supposed to remember the faith to be ethically good in those areas, but not a clear interaction, a sharp distinction between the sacred and the secular realm. And Ronner's whole life was meant to overcome that. His whole outlook was to undercut it, and so much of the theology he wrote was an effort to get beyond that and say, no, God isn't just transcendent up there. There isn't just a sacred world over here. That they interpenetrate. That's the meaning of incarnation, that God has taken flesh, has lived among us, has been inspirited in this world, so that we don't think of two realms, but one world, one sacred world in which we live, one supernatural world, so that there's no way to do a naturally good act. You can't do a naturally good act like we used to say. You know, well, to coach the Little League is a naturally good act, but to go to church is a supernaturally good act that gets you towards heaven. What we want to say now is there's just one world in which we live, one graced world, one spirit-filled world, so that to coach the Little League team is precisely the way one moves closer to God, and not just by reading the Bible or being at church. So it undercuts that kind of distinction. And it helps us to know that we are divinized, as the Greek fathers. Ronner loved to deal with the Greek fathers more than the Western fathers, because they had the sense that we are all divinized, that we are temples of the Holy Spirit. God lives within us now, so that we are these supernaturally oriented people. And that, of course, gives significance to everything that we are. All aspects of our life, our recreational life, our work life, all of those ways are the way we actually come closer to God. Interpenetration, one world. I might use this even further. It sets up one of the great criticisms of Ronner. I did want to do a little of that tonight. One of the criticisms of Ronner, then, is that he levels the whole world in a sense and won't give us yet this world of the sacred. That he doesn't see enough the way the church and the sacramental system sets up a sacred kind of world into which we must move, into which we sometimes operate, which will shape our consciousness and make us see the world in a different way. This is the criticism of one of the other great theologians of the 20th century by the name of von Balthasar. Von Balthasar did not like Ronner's. One time a friend of mine was with von Balthasar, and he said, "Well, did you read Ronner's new book?" And he says, "New book? What do you mean, new book? Ronner hasn't written a new book in 20 years. No, he's just written the old book over and over." Von Balthasar was not a great fan of Ronner's. I don't think I ever told that story before. That's one Ronner story I don't think I ever repeated before. So, but von Balthasar says that the Ronerian world gets too flat, too limited. He doesn't understand enough the way we are shaped by our experience of the Eucharist, by the sacred world of church and Bible. For Ronner, those things summarize what we do in the rest of life. We go to Mass not to just get into a separate world, but we go to Mass in order to pull together our regular world, in order to find deeper meaning in all of the rest of our activity, in order to get focused on what it is all about. It's interesting. I think I probably will write an article somewhere along the line trying to look at this question, this criticism of von Balthasar, to see whether it really holds water or not. It's connected tightly with the question of, is there any uniqueness about the priesthood? I have to give an important talk beginning of next October about uniqueness of the priesthood. The vocation directors in the United States want to know, well, they're trying to recruit people. They want to know, what are they selling if they want people to become priests? What is unique about all of that? And it's at least possible that, well, at least I would say this, at least one viewpoint is that the priest has the unique job of creating this sacred world for people. Now, Ronner wouldn't like that too much. Ronerian theologians would be interested in breaking down that distinction, would be interested in looking at the common priesthood and the way we all have to be in touch with the sacred. One of the things you see throughout all of this is the breaking down of distinctions between people in the Ronerian theology, spirituality, so that it's not like there's some people over here who are holier, fellow like the Pope, who's somehow closer to God or deserves to be called your holiness. No, Ronner doesn't like that kind of distinction. He doesn't think that makes sense. We are all in the same ballgame, all got the same baptism, nourished by the same Eucharist, all called to equal holiness. That you and I are called as much to holiness as the Pope. And that if we took the right factory worker and the right Pope, there wouldn't be much doubt which one was the holier in many cases. And as the more you learn about the history of the Church and some popes who didn't lead very exemplary lives, the more that becomes clear. So that Ronner is the same way with theologians. Ronner wants to insist that the theologian doesn't have a privileged access to the mystery of life. The theologian doesn't have something special call on Christ. That's all there for us. It's all part of this world of ours. That the theologian's job is to try to articulate that, to systematize it, to analyze it, so that all of us can see it more clearly. Well, all of those ways, Ronner really does not like those distinctions to be drawn up. He wants to see our commonness in the human quest. And he wants us to center not on the extraordinary, but on the ordinary ways of finding God. And those marvelous things about finding God in falling asleep and moving about and in laughter. I think that was the way we began this whole series, was talking about Ronner as the theologian of the ordinary, of the everyday, of the average, so that his big thing is the finding God in the simplest things of life, like going to bed at night and like laughing at jokes and so on. All of this becomes the real catalyst for our closeness to the Lord. Yes. Question along this line on distinction and Ronner's notion of women in the church. Well, as I said, in Ronner's theology, which is very influenced in a way or similar to the Latin American theologians' idea of the base communities. That's on my mind because I'm writing my reflections article tonight on the base communities. Ronner's got articles himself on the base communities. And his idea is that what we've got to do is surface leadership within small Christian groupings. Latin America, it's 15 families or so that are together and belong to these base communities, and that within those communities that the natural leaders should surface and take over, and that natural leader should be the one who celebrates the Eucharist. And that natural leader should have hands imposed by the bishop to link them and the community with the larger church. And in Ronner's opinion, it doesn't matter if that person who surfaces is married or unmarried, male or female. So in that sense, Ronner has really undercut, all of the distinctions that are used in order to keep women from achieving their proper status and role in the larger church. So that is, I would say, his most radical way of approaching the problem. On the other hand, Ronner has written tremendously interesting things about masculine and feminine differences. He does not shy away from facing that question. He never did and didn't along the line. In other words, he never did. He has a great sense of particularity, of bodiliness, of earthiness. Ronner never wants in his theology to go off into abstractions like, well, we're all the same. It's not that. It's not, well, we're all the same. Men and women are the same, and so on. He never, it was like that. He was too particular, too earthy, too much into bodiliness. So because of that, he was not hesitant to talk about male-female differences, even though when it was very unpopular to do so. And I think he's given us some marvelous senses of these distinct spiritualities and so on. Anyway, we'll end this before long, I guess. Yeah.
We were talking about self-acceptance, about love and death. I had a lady whose husband died probably almost 35 years. And he died almost 2 years ago. He had accepted to go to some Baptist Bible Church. But anyhow, he was crying death, and he had accepted. I think it's time to say after 2 years and the time that he's together later.
Yeah. The question is asked about the dealing with the death of a loved one, and it reminds me of the fact, I don't know if the lady's here who asked the question last week, but as someone told me, I completely missed the point of one of the questions last week, and as soon as they told me that, I quickly realized that, and was right, so I apologize for that. Which in her question is exactly the question you're asking now, I guess, as I re-understand the question. That is, how do we keep going, we the living, after, we're dealing with our deceased friends? So I could tell by her face I did not answer her question, but unfortunately I didn't know why. And so your question allows me to make comment on that. That lady here. Tell her, I'm sure. So tell her that I apologize. Well, that's right. I did not know her, and I didn't know what she was coming, but I should have been able to figure out the question since everyone else here did. But anyway, yeah, tell her that. But it's a very difficult question, obviously. I mean, how we deal with the death of one of my theories is that people end up in keeping a sort of low-grade grieving going, where they don't do either one of two things: either grieve totally and get into it, or let go of all of that. In other words, a lot of people, they don't ever grieve as thoroughly, as deeply, as radically as they ought to, and hold on to what I call a low-grade grieving continuously, regularly. And one of my theories of this is that what we've got to do is to do both of the other things. That is, we have to grieve well. Periodically, we have to really enter into the grieving process. Redo it in imagination. Think about it, cry over it, go over mementos, feel as bad as we can possibly feel. feel terrible. Intensify the grief is one way I would have of saying it. Use our imagination to think about all the sharpest, most intense ways we miss the person involved. And one can pick a birthday to do it, an anniversary, a day when it's raining, it's a day when one is naturally in a melancholic mood, but to pick it and to do it thoroughly for maybe hours if necessary, but it's so that one feels that one's getting somewhere near the bottom of that grieving. And then to let go of that and to try to get on with life and to set it aside, and then to force oneself to be active, to function, to be busy, and so on, bracketing the desire to feel sorry for oneself till a time when one can do that. I'll wait till Saturday when I've got 2 free hours, and I'll really feel sorry for myself. Then I will luxuriate in it, and so on. So that's one way that I would think of trying to. Is you taking notes on this, Billy, to tell my friends that of what how one might do this. Now, then it seems to me that it would be a matter of trying to understand something about what we think that death is, this passageway to a new and richer life. The obvious point is that we're really feeling bad about ourselves and what we miss, and not about the other person. It's possible at least to try to reverse that and to think they're happy, they've reached their fulfillment, they stay in solidarity with me. This deceased loved one continues to try to wish good for me and to help me. So that one tries to build up the idea that they are doing well, and that is our faith conviction. That helps to highlight what we're really troubled about, and that is the fact that we miss them. And I think Ronner's prayer that I gave you on that class on dying is so terrific, and he's going to read the whole thing. It's in Encounters of Silence, where he says that as we walk the path of life, there's now a gap that will never be fulfilled, that's always empty from then on when that loved one is not there. That's realism. That's not some pie-in-the-sky sort of thing that, well, everything's fine. It isn't fine. There's a longing, a missing, a gap. The path, the journey, the group we're with is diminished by the loss of this person. Therefore, I think we need to, again, be realistic about all of that. Then I think there's all of the common sense things about keeping active, of doing things, of being involved, of getting our mind off of ourselves, trying to do for others, which is always great therapy, keeping busy, keeping our prayer life in order. Prayer life helps to root us, to focus, to remember who we are and where we fit. And then I guess I go back to that final thing about the idea that death cannot break the bonds of love. That's a faith statement, but I think it's at the center of what we long for. That the relationship is not broken. Relationship is not ended. It takes on a different form, and it will take on another form when we go through the active process of dying and death. But it simply is not just irrevocably lost. That the relationship remains, but in a way that is very mysterious to us, that we don't understand, and so on. So those would be some of the elements that I would try to get into the process. Now, someone who's really troubled the way you are needs somebody to talk to. They need a counselor type. Probably they need to go through those stages. Elizabeth Ross tells us that a person who's grieving goes through the same kind of stages that a dying person does. So that there's this part of it is this anger over the fact that this has happened. Maybe even anger with the loved one who left us alone. Very common. Anger at that person. How could you leave me in this crummy situation here? Well, it's your fault. And that needs to be affirmed. People have got to be able to get that anger out. Ever tell that story in here? The lady I dealt with who tried to commit suicide multiple times. And he never really finally succeeded in doing that. And I kept talking to her and so on, trying to get at. And one day she just, out of a blue sky with no particular preparation, she just blurted out, "They wouldn't let me grieve." What? They wouldn't let me grieve. And she went back to the funeral of her husband. It had happened, I think, 7 years before. She says, they wouldn't let me grieve. She says they had this mass, and these grade school children were there saying all these beautiful, optimistic things, and it was all upbeat, resurrection, joy, and everything. And I never had my chance to be sad. And it was almost, they made me almost feel like I wasn't supposed to be sad. I was supposed to be happy because he was in heaven. I wasn't happy he was in heaven. I was mad, and I was hurting and grieving. They wouldn't let me grieve. This is the root of the woman's whole psychic disorder. So that we need to be able to face all of the negative feelings that go in connection with that whole process. Put all it down, don't yeah.
I think the one that I enjoyed was the one on the open. I remember trying to swear the young man with the love bombs and get the lunch and where she did.
Oh, yeah.
And then got into knowing our faith long enough.
Yeah.
I think that's a lot on that.
Yeah. It's one of my favorite themes, of course, the committed openness, the dialectical spirituality. Remember, Ron Arian's spirituality ends up being dialectical. That is, it sees that life is complex, and it's often a matter of keeping two things in fruitful tension, two tendencies that seem rather normal and natural. And our great danger is to collapse one of the other sides of the poles, one of the other parts of the dialectic. So that in this case, it is possible to get so committed to something that one can't see anything else. That one is just totally into this and has no feel for anything else that's going on. On the other hand, one can get so open, so flexible, that one is mindless, that one doesn't stand any place, just floating in the wind. So either tendency there to openness or commitment can get out of control and submerge the other pole. So what we end up needing to do somehow is to have a committed openness, to have those two things in fruitful tension. That becomes our way, I think, of dealing, as you said, with the fundamentalist outlook. The fundamentalism today, one of its great problems is its tendency to be exclusive, to say we've got the truth is in this book, the Bible, the truth is in our little group that gathers to study, it's in our non-denominational church or whatever, and to say everyone else is in the darkness. So they get an exclusivity about them that is very painful for others and makes dialogue impossible. So we're trying to see committed openness as an antidote to that. There has to be a proper recognition that God's truth and goodness and beauty is found in the world as a whole and in other groupings besides ours. So that's the basis for dialogue. That's why we as Christians can dialogue with our Jewish friends, or the Buddhists, or the Hindus, or the Muslims, or the Marxists, as Pope John reminded us. We can dialogue with them not as a tactic to convert them, but because they may well see something about the divine-human relationship that's crucial for us. They may well have an element of the truth that we haven't seen. They might have a particular virtue developed that is very weak in our own Christian community. So that we dialogue in order to learn to move towards a greater truth than either one of us has at a given moment. I think that's, that the committed openness is a stance that we really need in today's world for sure. Getting near the end of this, yeah.
Just to get back to Ronner's optimistic view on salvation, that the person, whatever kind of life he or she has led prior to that, rejection, whatever, or loyal service, upon death, the person will see God as irresistibly good, beautiful, loving, and respond to that. And he went on to say that you had talked to Ronner about that, and he said something like, if I had a little more time, a little more energy, I'd probably go back and look at that a second time. Well, I'd like to make a humble suggestion that our theologians, especially those who publish, somewhere might just give us a statement, a simple statement of the status of those kind of statements. Is this an insight? Is it a passing thought? Is it something they work through? Is it a conviction? Is it kind of their own personal dogma? so that we would know that, that it's not all the same thing, that
Yeah.
there are different levels.
That's a very good point. I'll try to make a brief comment about it. The comment is made about Ronner's very optimistic notion of salvation, which fundamentally says that we could never say that anyone has been damned in the history of the world, and that Ronner's own sense is that the all-powerful, all-loving God, we have to think that love is generally successful in what it wants to do, that is to save us. That really is an important part of the whole thing, that we would have to, somehow it's good for us to believe in that kind of optimism. And then he said that what he wanted to do, Origen, back in the early history of the church, held that doctrine. It was called apokatastasis. It was the doctrine that eventually everybody made it to heaven. And Ronner said that if he had time in his life, he wanted to redo that, to rethink it. So there's no doubt that Ronner had an extremely optimistic view of salvation. That's indisputable. Many people today tend to move in that direction. Certainly there's a movement away from Jonathan Edwards' notion that we are sinners in the hands of an angry God, and that he's just ready to cut the string at any moment, and we would fall down into the fires of hell, kind of thing that shaped much of our mentality in the United States. In general, you could say in theology, there's movement away from that kind of very negative, heavy, moralistic notion of who God is. I myself believe that a lot of this question is currently dealt with in terms of temperament. And that we don't have the careful theological work that's going on. So your call for careful theological.
By your own admission, he says it wasn't. And I would like to know that. So when I read something in theology that this is not a passing thought, that this is really something that this is the bottom line for him, and then I can treat it differently than if it's something that occurred to him because he had a bad night. That's the next point.
Yeah. Yes, well, I mean, for most things in Ronner, it's very clear. And there is a point in his where he stands. On this one, he does have that in writing in some places, where he has said that along this line, that he would like to rethink that particular doctrine. He's also has places in his earlier writings where he clearly says you can't hold that. So I think that that doctrine of origin. So I think that he didn't work it out. We're not going to find it from him. It'll be left to other theologians to work on. But in general, that's true. Theologians sort of have an obligation to try to say what is consensus point, what is seriously debated, what is a matter of opinion in the church, and so on. We used to call that the theological notes, and that's still important. We use different words today, but still important for the theologians to alert us to the state of the question. I think generally Ronner has been clear in that. That's one of the few areas where he simply didn't have time to work it out for himself. Looks like we're going to end up taking a break here after this first, which is fine. Now, this is sort of interesting to me about things that people latch on to. Let's take one more if we've got it, and then take a break. Yeah.
You already said a lot about this.
That imagery has become common, the vertical and the horizontal. The vertical obviously talking about our relationship with God. There's a whole piety or spirituality that moves in that direction. It likes to talk about saving one's soul and getting oneself to heaven. That thinks the essence of Christianity is almost exclusively with prayer and liturgy and Bible and so on. That is the vertical dimension. The horizontal dimension is to recognize the social gospel. It is to emphasize love of neighbor as well as love of God. It's to realize that the work for justice, as the 1971 Synod of Bishops said, work on behalf of justice is a constitutive element in the preaching of the gospel. That there is a proper quest for justice, that we're called upon to do that. So that is the horizontal dimension. In some ways it's very personal, like reaching out to the person in need. It's Matthew 25, feeding the hungry and giving drink to the thirsty. In another level, the horizontal takes on an institutional side. That is, it's seen that if we're going to make the horizontal effort, we're going to make the community of love real, that we have to attack structures and systems that are unjust. And we have to work to try to create a more just society. That's something we would get especially from the liberation theologians, but Rahner himself has written a great deal about that as well. And that's important, that horizontal side to Christianity. And of course, what we really want, as some have said, is this, right? The cross. The cross, which suggests both things to us. The very love of God, which always includes love of neighbor. Prayer, which always should lead to action on behalf of justice. Love of neighbor, which is really our way of loving God. So that a balanced spirituality, again, a dialectically sound spirituality, will have both a prayerful and a prophetic dimension. It will mean that we are worshiping, involved in liturgy, and that we're also involved in trying to help the poor. Both things will, and again, they won't just be side by side, not just sitting there. Sunday I'm a prayer, and Monday I try to feed poor people, but that those things are dialectically related. They feed one another. They fructify one another. So that, for example, when one is really worried about helping people, trying to help people, can be parents trying to take care of their kids, and or people trying to keep the soup kitchen going, or writing Congress about the nuclear question, whatever it is, that the great frustrations involved in that and the lack of progress should throw one back on prayer, should remind one of one's limitations. Instead of leading to just frustration, it ought to lead to prayer, to a deepening of the spiritual life. With the suggestion that maybe the people who have been able to sustain the effort are precisely those who have cultivated the spiritual life, who have kept prayer as part of their effort to earn a living, to raise a family, to take care of the place, to do all the things that are needed. Let's take a break, and we'll come back and talk about a simple spirituality. So what I will do is try to summarize a few things I was going to say here about the simple faith. Perhaps a brief section on the problem of the complexity of our world. I wrote on that recently, and maybe need to call to mind again some of those elements. I mean, obviously we live in a complex world. You know, things are changing rapidly. We got draws and tugs on our time. In our culture, we see a certain materialism, a consumerism. There's the world of advertising tries to make us feel always as though we don't have enough and need more things. The world gets very confusing. Many people have financial pressures, trying to figure out how to keep the family together. We have our unemployment problems, the poverty questions, and so on. We have all of our movements. We have the whole self-actualization idea, which puts sort of a new dimension in it. It's not just enough to do one's work and get other things done and so on, but there is the whole question of personal growth that's thrown into the mix. I remember giving talk to some corporate executives about time management, and just had them sit down and write down the number of hours they put in on job, family, and personal growth. It's a very interesting kind of thing to do, how many hours each day that one would spend in that way. And it's sort of revealing to them the imbalances in their lives, and very often, the great complexity that's involved in trying to manage all of those different demands on our time. Well, so part of the complexity is not just in terms of church doctrines and dogmas and rituals and laws. The complexity is built into the culture in which we live. They talk about future shock. That book by Toffler, I suppose, touched a lot of nerves in people, that The world is changing so fast, and the rate of change is accelerating that one almost wonders if one can keep pace or not. Will it run past one? Where will one get fixated? I had an interesting conversation with a fellow today about the problem of where will I quit growing? At what stage will I simply turn off like it's too much, get fixated in the process and say, well, that's the end of it now? So that's, I guess, one of the things I admire about older people who keep their minds alive, who continue to want to grow and develop. To me, that's very inspiring. That was, I talked about Earl Harris, the man with the blanket who used to come to these classes, and that was one part of his thing. His body was a mess, he said, but he wasn't going to let his mind die. He was going to keep alert, keep his mind going. He wouldn't care. He's just going to work at that like crazy. So he'd go to lectures and listen to tapes, and as long as his eyes lasted, he would read books and so on. And to me, that's very inspiring. But you've got this whole complex feeling like, would I really be able to manage that? Will it overwhelm me in some ways? Will that bit of knowledge out there, the new things to be known, just get to be too much? I think that's one of the things that happened to the clergy after the Second Vatican Council. Many clergy just felt overwhelmed. There were so many new ideas, so much new theology, so many lay people learning bits and pieces and expecting the pastors to know all of that or to be able to have read the latest book or to be up to date. And for some priests that I know, it just became overwhelming. It was just too much. The only thing one could do at that point to preserve one's psychic health and emotional life was to erect walls and barriers and say, geez, that's all. I'm not dealing with all these new things. I believe that was part of the problem the clergy were thrown into. Well, and do the same analysis from the viewpoint of parents. So many parents say it's so much harder to raise the youngest one than the older ones. That was relatively simple. But as the times changed, as the drug culture got started and so on, and the more demands and peer pressures and television and so on, it just somehow made my job as a parent so much more difficult. I think sometimes busyness is our, national neurosis or something. I mean, everybody's too busy to do anything, It's just amazing. So all of this is part of the complexity of life. Now, in trying to look at briefly at a Ronerian response to that, one of the things that Uncle Carl says is that we simply must endure that complexity. That's part of the realism of life. That's how the world is, and one isn't going to change that tomorrow. And there is a certain way in which one has to learn to swing with that, to go with the flow. Yeah, things are changing, and all right, but that won't undo me. Yeah, things are complex, but if I take it one day at a time, I can manage, or maybe 1 hour at a time on certain days. I can manage that. So there is a part of that is learning to live with a calm spirit and to be able to shift gears quickly. I feel that this is one of the, again, practical things that we need to learn for living in this world, to be able to be involved in one thing and then be able to move to the next without excessive anxiety about how this project was going to turn out or what went on there, or guilt feelings about not doing it well, or whatever the negative feelings might be, and to be able to quickly shift into the new project. Now, I'm going to test this tonight myself. I have to go home and write an article. And what will happen is that my mind will be back on this lecture, and I'll say, why did you say that dumb thing? Or, geez, you missed this important point. Or, boy, I'm really drained because I put everything in, I don't have enough energy. It seems to me that, what I'll have to do tonight is to shift gears. I got to let go of that, leave it behind me, get down to my desk and get pen in hand and start on that project. One of my mentors, John Macquarie, wrote one of his major books when he was living, I think, in a one-room apartment with a couple of kids, and where he had only 1 hour at most at any given time to work on the book. That's an example of being able to concentrate on what is at hand in the midst of complexity. And it's a skill. Now, some of us have it to a greater degree than others, but it seems to me we need to cultivate that as part of this realism. So we're not going to change a lot of this. Second thing is that we need to try to simplify our lives. Part of this would be to see through the world of advertising, or the whole consumerism that is in the culture, that works on the scarcity principle and the need principle. That is, it works on the idea that we're always about to run out of something. Like Schlitz, you know, you need a whole pool full of Schlitz when your buddies drop over, you know. I mean, because you're in danger of running out. So scarcity is anything. But it seems like one of the skills we need to learn in our world is to see through that. I'm of the opinion that most of us somehow are influenced by this consumerist mentality, even if we think we're not. I believe it's almost impossible to live in our culture without being touched by it. So we can make fun of those other people who get sucked in by the world of advertising and aren't smart like I am. But I would think it's much more fruitful to figure out the subtle ways in which that world infects my own thinking. The world that says that manufactures needs, that tells me I need certain things when really I probably don't. So if we're going to simplify our lives, you have to see through that whole world. One of the keys in all of this is to make sure that people remain more important than things for us. That's one of the priorities that would sort it all out for us. People are the important elements in our lives. I guess that what we would like to do is to try to deepen what goes on. To develop all this whole course in a way of trying to get at the spiritual life would be a way of undercutting the superficiality of the culture. I think of Merton. Did I say this last time? He wrote that marvelous essay when he talks about sitting under a tree and reading a book, and he titles it Confessions to the State. And he says, yes, I must admit, I am a subversive person. I've been sitting here for a whole hour under this tree and have done absolutely nothing. I must confess that I am guilty of this crime against the state. Now, it is his satirical way, of course, and it goes on, marvelous article that he wrote, but goes on trying to point out, I mean, the way we can get sucked up in a culture that makes it sound as though we're only good if we are productive, accomplishing. I mean, in the same article, it says something about, yes, there's been a fly on my book here for the last half hour, and I've not even bothered to swipe it away. You know, I must confess this. It does indeed prove that I am a radical revolutionary. Crime against the state. I'm not productive, not accomplishing anything. Well, it's that kind of idea that I'm trying to get at here, I guess, of this simplification. One of Rahner's cautions in all this is we who live in this culture, not in talking about poverty or being poor, and this goes for members of religious orders as well, as Rahner points out, is that we can never really be poor in this country. We can't be as poor as 2/3 of the people in the world are just naturally. So it's almost silly in a sense to talk about that kind of poverty in any actual kind of sense. The poorest people in our country still usually can find something to eat, although I recognize they have certain malnutrition problems and so on. But we have to be realistic about this simplification. We're not going to be as poor as most people are in the world. So that Rahner says that part of what we need to do in response to that is check our attitudes out, to make sure we have not made an idol out of any particular thing or possession, to cut through all of that and be ready to let go of the possessions that we have, not to make a god out of them, to get our attitudes in place on material things. Well, maybe enough, by the way. So 2 things he's saying. One is there's a certain acceptance of complexity of the culture in which we live, that there's givens that simply cannot be changed, at least as we currently look at the scene. Not against social change, not against trying to improve the structures. That's part of his thinking. But as we look at our life today, there's certain givens that are simply there. And on the other hand, he says, let's try to introduce the simplifications that we can. Let's learn the deep message that in dealing with the important things of life often are the simple things, the love that exists between people, the simple ways of celebrating the good things of life, the prayer that we have, the liturgies, the good conversations, the beauties of nature, all things that are free and simple and that we can drink in without letting the world of needs and materialism and consumerism just take us over. For most of us, that means, I think, sort of a critique or a lessening, getting into perspective of this world of consumerism, materialism. I think I'm going to stop there and see if anybody has any questions about that or comments. Here's a good idea. People have not had a chance to talk. Let's do our one-to-one discussion for a minute, and why don't you do it on this simplicity of lifestyle. Okay, I'd like now to go look at this question not just in terms of lifestyle, dealing with complexity, but also in terms of our belief system, the faith that we have. And in this case, the problem is that very often our Christian religion appears to us as a strange series of doctrines, a lot of which are hard to understand, things like the Assumption and the Immaculate Conception and the hypostatic union and the Trinity and all kinds of things that are just difficult and we don't know how they hold together, or a whole series of moral laws that are often hard to keep and bind us and force us to do things we don't want to do, or a whole series of rituals, liturgy, sacraments that often contain strange elements like the use of oil or saying of certain words and so on that, again, often escape us as to exactly what they mean. That's a way in which the Christian faith appears to be sort of a big blob, maybe, a big package, and it's hard to know how it all fits together or hangs together. Now, that problem is intensified in the modern world because we don't like that, because we tend to want quick, precise summaries of things, because we watch a half-hour news when in a minute and 30 seconds they give us the whole story in capsule form. We're the people who read Time or Newsweek and in a couple pages get a clear summary of what is going on. We learn to expect that. That's the way the world runs. I want a report on my desk. I want it to be one page and easily assimilated. So, we expect some sort of simplicity in the midst of the intellectual complexity that is in our world. Now, thirdly, the problem is created by the fact that many of our traditional creeds, which had the job of summarizing the faith for us, don't seem to do it for many people. We've got the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed that we say at Mass, but for many people it doesn't really pull it together. It doesn't really summarize what the faith is all about. The words may be strange. The notions don't quite fit for us. We don't understand the categories. They were written a long time ago. They don't seem to connect in with our given experience. For some people, the creeds might do it, but I think for many moderns, they simply don't perform the function we would like, that is, of pulling it into some sort of simpler form. Well, Rahner's response to all of that is that we need today short creeds. Creeds that fit our culture, our time, which fit the various situations of people, ages, cultures, and so on. In other words, we need a whole bunch of new creeds that summarize what the Christian faith is all about. We need a creed for first graders and for seniors in high school, for widows, for collegians. So we need specific creeds for every group. Now, a lot of times, what is needed with all of this, of course, is to have people write their own creed. That would be the one that would really pull it together, rather than getting it from somebody else. That would be an interesting exercise for the people who are at most of these talks, to try to, out of that material or any other material you have at hand, to try to pull together your own creed. A way of, so if someone said to you, well, I hear you're a Christian, what does it mean to be a Christian? So you could say it in a few sentences or a paragraph in a way that would feel right to you and would make sense to the person you were talking to. It's a great exercise, and people who are into follow-up to this series and to tonight's session, I would really strongly advise you to go home and try to do that. Now, Ronner says if you're going to do that, you ought to try to get at least 3 major doctrines into your creed. One, it should have some kind of a notion of the Trinity in it. Secondly, it should have the incarnation, the fact that the great God has come and lived among us personally. And thirdly, it should have a notion of grace. So for Ronner, those are the 3 major kinds of doctrines. I could put it this way, that for him, the key notion is the self-communication of God. That the great God gives of herself to all of us. And in doing this, this is what we mean by grace, this self-giving. And the great God has then communicated itself in a total and complete way in the incarnation, in Jesus of Nazareth. And that will all be completed at the end time when we are joined into the great family in heaven. Those self-givings of God come to us, therefore, through Christ and through the Spirit. The Father giving of self through the Son and the Spirit. So there you see Trinity, you see grace, and you see incarnation. Ronner thinks those are the key ideas that have to end up in your creed, that's what Christianity is all about, in a way. Then, major point is that these creeds have to be seen as a response to our real needs and longings. That what we've got to see is that Christianity is not just another religion or a nice thing or something we turn to in the midst of suffering, but Christianity has to be seen as everything, as the total response to the question that lurks in our heart. In one of the other classes, we talked about that idea about all of us sooner or later in our lives are brushed by the question. And the question is not, how am I going to get enough money to make it through the next year? But the question has to do with ourselves, of who are we, and is there any meaning in our lives, and are we heading any place? So that's what the question is. It's a question of purpose and meaning and identity. And what Ronner says is that we've got to get the feeling for ourselves, the conviction, and be able to say it to our children, the next generation, to other people who inquire, that Christianity is the answer to the question. It's the response, it's everything, it's the totality. It's not just one other nice thing that happens to be around in the world along with baseball and motherhood or something. Oh, that it is everything. So, we got to see the Christian response is the real response to our existential questions, to the longings of our hearts. Then, the next step in this whole process, I suppose, is to come up with creeds. I am kicking myself now because I forgot a book that I wanted. Ronner, anybody got Ronner's Foundations of Christian Faith here? Who? I thought, sure, don't you carry it with you wherever you go? Oh, my. Well, I would do these by heart, but I haven't looked at them for a while, and I can't remember them. Anyway, at the end of Ronner's whole book, The Foundations of Christian Faith, in the epilogue, in the last pages, you see Ronner gives us 3 creeds. And my great joy in teaching classes on Ronner, to be able to have students at the end of the 18 series lecture read these 3 creeds and understand them. That's one of my great delights in life. I just deprive myself of this. To see that this is very hard. I mean, if you tried to read them 18 weeks ago, you'd never know anything what they mean. You know, they're very difficult creeds. Yet these are his three efforts at a simple statement of the faith. I can't. I could try to remember it, but it won't come off unless I remember the whole thing, so I'm not going to try. Thus it is. However, we do need not just for honor to write creeds for us, but we got to come up with our own. And therefore, I have written a few here that I will share with you. Most people here have already heard me do my brilliant creed for kindergartners, which I consider sort of the triumph of my theological career. And I will repeat that for those who have not heard this creed for first graders or kindergartners. And it goes like this. Even when you do something bad, there is someone who still loves you. And we call that one God. And he talked to us through Jesus. Now I figure that if we could get kindergartners to learn that, first graders, or maybe us too, we would be light years ahead. You see, what the creed does is play to the existential problem. That is, that when the small child does something bad, they are in danger of being thought that they are a bad person. That they're not loved. And we know so many problems that come up in life precisely because people don't feel loved. Very often it's because the people who have dealt with them have made them feel guilty over what they did wrong. So this creed is designed to play to that existential problem. Even when you do something bad, notice it doesn't say even when you are a bad child or when you're bad, but it emphasizes when you've done a bad thing. Then there's still someone who loves you, which is true, you see, for all of us all the time. No matter what that's our great belief, isn't it? That no matter what we would do wrong, however we would mess up in our lives, we are still loved. And the one who still loves us unconditionally always is the great God. Even if our mother should not love us, the Scriptures say, still, I will continue to love you. So, this is what we're going to get. And this, how do we know this? Well, he talked to us through Jesus. Now that could go on. If you wanted to go on, you'd say, and we in the church are the ones who talk about Jesus or remember Jesus. Church is the group of people who remembers Jesus. Our liberation theologians have picked up on that theme, the memory of Jesus. They call it the dangerous memory of Jesus because it challenges our complacency and so on. Okay, so there's an example of a short creed that we could use with very little children to help them to know that Christianity is the essence of life. It's what it's all about. In fact, if we all knew that much, we'd all be better off. There'd be fewer guilt feelings. There would be fewer poor self-images. There would be fewer psychic problems. There would be more energy release. There'd be a clearer focus on what life is all about. No matter how limited are we or how we've messed up in our lives, there's someone who loves us. And how do we know that? By looking at the human face of Jesus. Where do we celebrate that? In the church, in the power of the Spirit. Now, here's one I tried for collegians in the United States. This one I don't think is so good. The other one I'm big on. But this one is not as impressive, to say the least. In fact, I don't like it now when I'm reading it. Well, I'll tell it to you anyway as a flawed effort. I'm sure other people could do much better. I can see what the problem is with it. I must have written this a while back. Anyway, it says this. I'm thinking of trying to improve it as I go along, but I'll resist that. I'll improve it later. Just read it straight. The mystery that surrounds us and grounds and draws all of our spiritual activity is gracious and has come near and spoken to us definitively in Jesus of Nazareth, who continues to affect us in a tangible way in and through the church. Well, people can immediately see one of the great defects of this creed is that it does not draw enough on the existential experience of the collegian. It should say something like, in our quest for a greater love. Oh, now there would be an improvement on the creed. In our common quest for a greater love, which is something that the collegian can recognize, or in our quest for personal fulfillment and integrity. Then we could go on to say we need to remember that the mystery that surrounds us, is the source of that drive and the fulfillment. Anyway, that is a very defective creed there for collegians. You up to a few more here? What to do? I think I will take, this is a very long one. My mother cannot stand to have speakers read, but it's the way it goes, Lillian. You'll have to put up with this. She says it's a very ineffective technique. Maybe if I comment on it, it'll make it better. We human beings experience ourselves as essentially mysterious. For example, we long for a love both satisfying and imperishable. When we experience intimations of this kind of love, we rejoice and sense that it is coming from a source beyond our control. Another mysterious aspect of our experience is the troubling battle we know within ourselves between constructive and destructive tendencies. Angels and demons fight for control of our soul. This raises the question of the relative power of good and evil in ourselves and in our world. There is no denying we are threatened by sin and guilt, and evil is embedded in our social system. This harsh fact is reflected in our doctrine of original sin. You will see one of my strategies at work here is to describe the reality and then to link it with the tradition. You notice I try to describe the destructive tendencies, all of that, and say that's what we mean by original sin. In other words, if someone asks you, what do you believe in as a Christian? I said, well, we believe in original sin. Well, what's that? In other words, you can't do that. Even if you say, well, we believe in redemption through Christ or salvation through the cross. Well, that doesn't mean anything to anybody. In fact, the very words grace, salvation, redemption can't be used generally in our culture to communicate much of anything. So we're going to tell the next generation or tell our friends what it is we believe, we can only use those words after we've explained them. So that's why I did that way there. However, our faith-inspired position is that the forces of good are more powerful than all evil. That a healing, transforming power is at work in our world. That the work of creation, ourselves included, possess an essential goodness. The good news is that we are loved despite our unworthiness, and that we are accepted despite our limitations. In our knowing, loving, and struggling, we can recognize ourselves as related to a source and goal which always exceeds our grasp. It seems appropriate to refer to this essentially incomprehensible and inexhaustible power as the mystery. The core of our belief system insists that this mystery is on our side, can be trusted, and addresses us personally, Therefore, we describe it as the gracious mystery and call it God. Again, describe, you can't just say, I believe in God, because for many people in the culture, they say, well, what do you mean by God? The very question of God is now up for grabs. Who is God? So, instead of saying we believe in God, today we have to say try to describe it as this mystery that can be trusted, is on our side, and that's what we call God. This deity is not a particular being or one aspect of our total experience, but the personal condition, backdrop, horizon, basis, ground, and fulfillment of everything we are and do. One senses the Ronarian language. In fact, after this was published, someone wrote me a letter and said, I loved your Ronarian creed, even though Ronner's name was never mentioned, but all of his language is in here. The mystery both fascinates us and strikes us as awesome. We experience ourselves at times as hovering over a dark abyss, but we believe that if we let go, we will fall into gracious hands. The mystery allures us into the unknown future and promises us a final fulfillment of all of our deepest longings. We call this salvation and believe we already have a partial share in this blessing as we journey toward our final goal. So that's sort of the attempt to get at God, in a sense, of who summarized that for ourselves. The key words are source and goal. We believe the mystery does not remain aloof from our concerns, nor merely send us messages from afar. Rather, the gracious one enters into our history, penetrates our experience, surrounds our existence, knocks at the doors of our hearts, and calls to our spirit. This personal self-giving, which we call grace, modifies our existence, changes our consciousness, and echoes in our mind and heart. It creates a universal revelation which has been experienced by all human beings through the call of conscience, the intuition of truth, the attraction of goodness, and the allure of beauty. When individuals respond positively to this universal revelation, they enter into a transforming relationship with the mystery, which we call justifying grace. The yes to the call of conscience and the search for truth constitutes a saving faith and makes us dwelling places of the Spirit. I think my mother's right. What do I do now? You see, here's the article. I'm up to there, and it's that much yet. What do I do now? Summarize quickly, read faster, or punt? The extent and intensity of the communication of the mystery depends on the receptivity of the individual. Those who have been blessed with greater openness and the ability to interpret this relationship correctly are called prophets. We do not hesitate to give this title to the Buddha and Muhammad, as well as Moses and Isaiah. But our hearts yearn for a final prophet, for one with a definitive word from the deity, for an individual worthy of absolute trust, for one who carries all the hopes of humankind, for the Savior who conquers even death. The good news is that such a one appeared in our history. We know him as the carpenter from Nazareth, itinerant teacher, master storyteller, proclaimer of the kingdom, friend of outcasts, example of love, miracle worker, shaker of the establishment, innocent victim, crucified Lord, and resurrected Savior. Jesus of Nazareth surpasses all previous prophets and will be superseded by none in the future. Here is a man like us in all things but sin, who is so open, so responsive, so obedient to the mystery, which he addressed in the most familiar fashion as Abba, that it is true to say that he is God personally present to us. Thus, in our history, God's self-giving and human receptivity have reached a never-to-be-surpassed high point in Jesus of Nazareth. We call this union the Incarnation, and therefore view Jesus not merely as a great ethical teacher, but also as the cosmic Lord and the Son of God. In his death, Jesus definitively completed a lifetime of dedication to doing the will of Abba. With his cause going badly, his friends deserting him, his message of peace misunderstood, Jesus surrendered himself totally and finally to the Father. And in this very act of self-sacrificing love, his cause was won, his teaching vindicated, his obedience rewarded, his life renewed, his spirit shared. We call this action of God on behalf of Jesus the resurrection, and see it as the center point of our faith. We desperately want to believe that the good will triumph, that love will prove stronger than death, that our efforts will be rewarded, that we will live a richer life forever. The resurrection of Jesus tells us we can indeed believe this to be true. The continuing struggle from Adam onward between grace and sin is now irrevocably decided in favor of grace. History will reach its appointed goal. The flow of life is toward salvation. The final victory of good and truth is assured. I'm going to stop there. And the rest of the creed goes on and talks about the church and so on and the sacraments. Well, that is a way to that point to try to pull together a way of saying what the faith is. That creed's a little longer, maybe. Maybe you like the one for kindergartners better. Anyway, I almost undercut my message of simplicity here. If you try to boil that down, one is back to the idea that the mystery that surrounds us is gracious and has drawn near in Jesus of Nazareth and has vindicated that whole message through the resurrection of the Lord. Anyway, however you take those particular efforts, what does seem important is that we find our own way to pull that together, find our own way to say what the faith is for ourselves, find our language that makes sense to us. That would become our good way of praying then. So that becomes a part of the way we think of who we are as Christians. So it's a really invitation to get at that simplicity. Well, Ronner says, and what I think is true is that Christianity is not just a bunch of rules and truths and rituals. It all comes together. It is, so we say these days, Christocentric. You can take any doctrine, any teaching, any sacrament, any ritual, any law, and show how what it does